I have a little bit of experience under my belt, so to speak, in regards to emergency power, which is what I was tasked to talk on today. And specifically, let's talk about scenarios. And we live in this first world nation, this great nation of the United States, but often we're fortunate in that we've become very dependent on power. But how many people in the last month has gone without power? Nobody. One person. Two person. Okay, three. For how long? An hour. Anyone longer than an hour? 5 hours? That's pretty much par for the course, right? Most of us have been without power in the last, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years, if you've lived in this area, for not more than a few hours. In some cases, in the wintertime, there's been places in Salt Lake I know that have been out for days and weeks, but those are isolated areas. Anyone here from the East Coast, Southeast, Florida, and hurricanes? How long have you been without power in your ice storms? How long did those last?
Some ice storms you can be without power for several days.
Several days of being without power.
And no heat.
And no heat, which is what we'll talk about, the need for power. So most of us, in many regards, are novices in doing without power in those respects. Most of the time, the thing we have, the emergency that we go through is, oh, my battery's dead. And that's about it, right? So let's talk about a little more in-depth power outage. What would happen if in an earthquake scenario here in this state? That's probably the most likely case where we would all be without power for an extended period of time. That maybe a winter storm might take us without power. So what would you need in this? Give me, shout out things that you would absolutely need if you were without power. Insulin. So we have a medical need, insulin. Why? And insulin isn't necessarily, you don't need power for it, but you need power to keep it cold. So without power, you lose your refrigeration. If you lose your refrigeration, you lose your freezer, you lose all the food in there. And how many hours do you have to go with to get power back on your refrigerator or freezer? 2 or 3? Some refrigerators that are old enough, that's about it. So if you leave the door shut, you could probably nurse that refrigerator for maybe 12 hours before it gets above 50 degrees, and then you'll lose your food. Your freezers might last a little longer. Anyone know how much power your refrigerator will use in a 24-hour period? Is that a concept we need to discuss? The consumption of power. How do we rate power? So power, we talk about, if you've heard the term volts and you've heard the term amps and you've heard the term watts, most of the time watts, this is about a 3-watt light bulb. Your old typical incandescent light bulbs at home were 60-watt light bulbs. Your refrigerator in a 24-hour period, it uses about 100 watts to 120 watts an hour, when it's plugged in and it's in the compressor's on. So in about a 24-hour period, you would use 1,200 to 1,500 watt hours of electricity in a standard refrigerator. And that means that, if it ran for 24 hours and it used 100 or 50 watts of electricity in 24-hour period of time, 50 plus for 1 hour, 50 plus the next hour, 12 hours, you would have used, 600, 700 watts. In another 12 hours, you'd use 1,200 watts. So understanding what power consumption an important appliance has is essential to knowing how to provide backup power or emergency power to replace it. I don't have it with me. There's a little meter you can buy for 20, 30 bucks called a kilowatt meter. It's just a little box that you plug into your wall, and then you plug your appliance into that meter, and on it, it gives you a readout. And if you have something like a refrigerator, you plug it in, and it starts recording how much power that refrigerator used. And then 24 hours later, you go back and you look on the meter, and it says 1.2, which would be 1.2 kilowatts or 1,200 watts of electricity that it used during that period of time. And at least at that point, you know, well, if I want to preserve get my refrigerator, well, I need to provide a power source. And what are those power sources? What we start over here was with a gas generator is probably the old standby that people have used. And there's these generators, they will come in different wattage outputs. This generator will produce up to 2,000 watts of electricity. So we talked about watt hours, which is the amount of time or amount of power over time. That's not the same thing. 1,200 watt hours isn't the same thing as 2,000 watts. This says that it will provide 2,000 watts at a single moment in time. So your blow dryer might take 1,500 watts to run it just on high. And then if you run it for 24 hours, that's 1,500 times 24. So you wouldn't want to run a blow dryer for 24 hours. That would use a lot of electricity. A refrigerator might use 100 watts of electricity when it's cycling on, or 200 watts of electricity, and then it cycles off when the compressor stops. And then when it cycles on again, that, and all total that. So a refrigerator might only use 200 watts, which that's only a tenth of what this generator can provide. So this generator would run a refrigerator just fine, probably even 2 or 3. But there's also an issue you need to understand is when a motor starts up, it takes a lot of electricity to get that compressor starting. So it might need 1,500 watts of electricity to get that compressor going. And so this 2,000 watt would start that, and then after the refrigerator gets running, it might idle down to about 100 watts of electricity. So those are important aspects to know. Anything with a motor or a compressor, they have like a wheat grinder. If you plug in a wheat grinder and turn it on, especially if there's wheat already in the gears kind of thing, it might use 1,500 watts of electricity. And there are smaller generators than this that might only do 1,000 watts, and they might not start up some wheat grinders. A bread mixer, they might use 800 watts to start up when you're kneading it, and then it cycles down to 20, 30 watts when it's just already going. So those are aspects too. Then a typical home might use 1,000 watts of electricity every hour. My typical household usage on average over the years about 20,000 kilowatt hours a day. And that's just for a 2,000 square foot home and so on. And your own electric consumption might vary. So this little generator may not handle my whole home, but it will handle the essential things. And like we talked about, refrigeration might be an essential thing. You want to preserve your food and keep that going, but you might do without lighting. You might do without, your radio, your TV, your cell phone, all those other type of things while you're just keeping your refrigerator, because that's an essential device. And that's what you need to consider. That's the scenario. What other essential devices do you need to use in a power outage?
Medical.
Okay.
Like Cpaps or oxygen.
Good. Yep. Cpap or an oxygen concentrator, medical devices. A Cpap would use, maybe 20 to 30 watts, when it's running. And if it has a humidifier, it might use more. A lot of the newer Cpaps would use less. So if you've got an old one, it might be time to upgrade. But again, you'll need that Cpap usage for 8 hours. If you're going to sleep 8 hours, that's 30 watts times 8. So that's 240 watt hours of electricity. A generator would certainly use that, but it would also be very loud during the night, and you'd use a lot of fuel just for that little bit of thing, which comes in maybe a battery option that you can tie into that. Any other essential devices you would heat? How much? So most of us have central heating. A heat pump might be all electric. Most of us probably use natural gas, but the natural gas furnaces require a little glow plug, which is like a short spike of electricity to start the natural gas going. And then the fan, when it's running, is going to use a considerable amount of electricity. So a furnace would use about 1,200 watts of electricity to, for their glow plug to start the natural gas burning. Then as the fan's going, that's using the 200 to 300 watts of electricity every time, so for as long as the fan's going. And then it's going to cycle on and then cycle off. And when it's off, it's probably has a very little draw. But heat, if you want heat, something like this would likely handle your furnace. But if you want to do your furnace and your refrigerator, then you need to start adding up these things. And at some point, this 2,000 watts may not be able to kick on the furnace at the same time your compressor in your refrigerator and the compressor in your freezer is kicking on. So you might have to bump up to a 3,000 watt generator or a 5,000 watt generator. All told, typically a home would need about a surge of about 6,000 to 12,000 watts to be able to handle that surge, depending on what type of devices you have. So, if you're dealing with solar inverters and that, 6,000 watts is kind of the minimum they say for, you might say, a home system. If you're in an RV or those type of things, you could probably live on a 3,000 watt inverter type system. But I just kind of went way over on a different topic. The point too is, okay, in a typical home scenario where the power is out for an extended period of time, you can look at a gas generator, and a gas generator, that's going to provide 2,000 watts for as long as you have gasoline to put into it. Another option like this one, this is both a gasoline generator, and it's also been retrofitted to work with propane, and it'll also work with natural gas too. So I can use a propane tank, which, equivalent wise, this is maybe 3-ish gallons of, equivalent to about 3 gallons of gasoline in this propane tank. So this only holds a gallon of gasoline, but if I use propane, just in this size of tank, I've tripled my longevity by going to propane. Propane isn't as energy providing. It doesn't, it'll do the job, but sometimes it might deteriorate the 2,000 peak, power outage. You might only get 1,800 or 1,600 because it just doesn't have the oomph that gasoline does. But for longevity, and it's much easier to store and safer to store. You had a question?
How do you retrofit one of those generators to do a...
Yeah. So the question is, how do you retrofit? There are kits you can buy online for about $200-300 that sit between the carburetor and the manifold. And you just put that in there, and there's a hose that goes through. There's also a gentleman in Up in Bountiful that will retrofit some generators. But nowadays, you can also just buy them already done. Propane, Costco sells them, most of the Home Depot, most of those places, you can buy a unit that already has that done with it. Question back?
Is there a good solar generator?
Yeah, I'll get into that here in just a second for about a solar generator. So in these cases, what the question came up there, we talked about AC power and DC power. Typically, how I view it, AC power is what you power your home with. DC power is what you power your car with or your RV. If you have an RV or trailer, shore power is like AC power. It's what you have home. You plug that in, and then your trailer runs on AC power. When you're boondocking or you're on the road and you're not hooked up to that power source, then you're running on DC power. And DC power, the technical differences aside, just means DC is basically what you'd see in a battery of any kind. Your car batteries, 12-volt DC. Your RVs run on a bigger bank of 12-volt DC. Some would have 24 volts. They're just different ways to do it. And when we start talking about battery is a storage mechanism. And basically one of the first things you need to consider in your emergency thing is batteries, right? We have batteries. You know, I look at this, and when you started working with batteries, 20, 25 years ago, this was everything. This is just an alkaline battery, and you'd have a lantern that you'd plug in, you'd add 3 batteries to this, and then you would run it for 6 to 12 hours on a set, and then you empty that and you change out the batteries and you run it for another 12 hours. So you can buy these and they store for about 7 to 10 years and still have, even after 10 years, they'll have about 80% of their life in if they don't leak, right? I've lost many battery to those leaking ones, but it's a great beginning start to your emergency power needs. You need, because light, none of you mentioned light as an essential thing. If once the suns go down, your refrigerator's taken care of, and that your light's probably one of the key things that you're going to wish and want. It's going to be an essential matter. So how long will your candle burn? How much light output does that candle provide? Is it going to burn my house down if the kids tip it over? And that's about 20 years ago when LEDs first started coming out, and I first started seeing LED lanterns. I basically put my candles, my propane lights, my kerosene lights, back in the back storage, and went pretty much all LED, just because, with something like this and this, I can, have 3 days of battery, 3 days of light, for, 4 or 5 hours of light per night. So very, very good option for light. And then we get into, go through your non-rechargeable batteries, and you start going into rechargeable batteries. Then you got, these are batteries I bought probably in 2006 in a loop, back when they were made by Sanyo. Nowadays they're made by Panasonic. But these batteries are nickel metal hydride. It's a type of rechargeable chemistry. And I just pulled these out and checked the charge up, and even after, 15 years, they still have about 3/4 of their power left, and I can cycle them up again 2 or 3 times, and I get about 90-95% of their life again. I can use them just almost, they're only about 5% degraded over that 15-year period. So these little AA batteries are great for, using for lights. And as Scott mentioned, charging up with a little battery charger and a little solar panel. In this case, this is a little 20-watt solar panel, which is often my minimum size I like to go with. This has a little USB plug in the side, and I can plug in, a little AA battery charger, and in 3 hours, I've got at least 2, and if I use another charger, I can charge, 4 batteries up in a few hours' time, and those 4 batteries will fit in my light and run it for another 12 or so hours. So great long-term case is just a little solar panel and rechargeable batteries. And again, I really like the Eneloops and really recommend those. These Eneloop.
And where do you get those?
Amazon. Yeah, Costco. Just a 20-watt solar panel. And so alternate sources, again, from gas generator, again, 2,000 watts, probably a good minimum, though you can get smaller if your needs are less, and you might need bigger depending on, if you're starting dealing with oxygen concentrators and some things that need a lot more power. If there's other medical needs, then you have to tailor your power creation, which is what a gas generator, it takes fuel and turns that fuel into energy or into power. That's one option. Now, And communications is another essential need too in many cases. Question?
What did you just say? 2,000 watt something?
A 2,000 watt gas generator. That will, this 2,000 watt generator will at any single time be able to output 2,000 watts of electricity.
But would it be better to use that generator to charge up a battery and use the battery?
You can't, yes.
Maybe it would be better if you repeated the question
Yes.
that you do.
Sure. So the question was, would it be better to take a gas generator and charge up a battery? And I think that's a great option. In stages, though, if you were to start one place, maybe a gas generator that you stored fuel, or a propane generator that you could store fuel that you ran continuously might be the first option, because generators might go from $400 to $1,200 or more dollars for this size of generator. Hondas are typically $1,000, and then doing that, the Costco's are in the $300 to $500 range for a similar type unit. But I don't necessarily want to run generator all the time, and so the other option is to store it in a battery. I've got a battery unit here that holds 3,000 watt hours of electricity. So if you remember our discussion about a refrigerator, this would run it for roughly 2 days straight. If all I plugged into it was a refrigerator, I could have refrigeration for 2 days without having to recharge it. Question.
Would it ever be okay to have the fridge plugged in for a couple hours, then unplug it for a couple hours, then plug it in for a couple hours?
Exactly. So that's the question. The question was, could you take your refrigerator to nurse it along and use your battery less? Is just run it for a few hours, then unplug it. And when you unplug it, you don't open that door. And then you open the door when you need to and take stuff out or use it, and then you plug it back in so it cools down for another 3 hours. You might only plug it in for an hour, unplug it for 3 or 4, and so on. Okay.
So you have a 2,000 watt generator there, and your refrigerator is taking 1,500 of it on the startup, and using about 300 to keep it running. If you keep a running total of everything that you want to use, you can very easily run multiple things during that time, not just the refrigerator.
Yeah.
Let's say you want to run a blender, or you want to run a vacuum. Now these are kind of outlet things that are part of the down situation. But if you keep a running total of what uses what, you'll be able to find out that you can run quite a bit of stuff on just a 1,000 watt or 2,000 or 3,000, whatever size you're using.
Yeah. So the comment was that if you work it right, you can make one of these 2,000 watt generators run any number of devices and appliances at different times, as long as they're not all coming on at the same time. So you can really make it work, in an emergency, and that's what we're talking about. Let me over here. Question.
There's an accessory called a kilowatt, KILL-A-WATT, that you can buy that will monitor how much of that you're using from second to second.
Yeah, kilowatt meter. Did you have another question?
Yeah, I'm just curious, is there just a bunch of outlets on that generator, kind of like the battery, and you're just plugging random stuff into it?
So let me go on. So on the side of the generator, there's basically, it looks just like a household outlet. There's two, just like a wall outlet, right? And you just plug in. If you get a generator, you need to get extension cords, because the generator has to stay outside, preferably about 20 feet away from the eaves of the house, because it does create carbon monoxide. Propane, another benefit of propane is it does burn a little cleaner. So, and that's one option. But just like plugging it, this is basically a portable wall outlet. Typical home wall outlets, 15 amps, provides about 1,500 watts of electricity. And that's kind of what you get here, constantly using a gas generator. So think of it as I've got my refrigerator. I'm taking that plug on an extension cord, plugging it in here, running it for a few hours. Then maybe I'm taking blender, my toaster, my other devices that are essential, and I plug them in at the same time. So it's basically a portable wall outlet, and that's about all you get.
So if you had an extension cord that's outside and you have a long extension cord in the house, you would just be doing it through the extension cord, or would you have to come back out to this?
Well, as long as this is running, then the extension cord is going to be, it's going to provide, if there's nothing plugged into it, it idles down really low and uses very little fuel. And then the minute something needs power, it'll idle up, it'll power up. So generators are good. There's a long track record. The one thing you just need to be aware of when you're done using them, once the emergency is over, is to what they call run it dry. These have some of the older models, many of the models still have carburetors, and the gasoline will sit in the carburetor. The modern gasoline isn't the best. It creates varnish and other type of things that can cause issues. So once you use it, you have to, some of the generators don't have it. I had to add one to it, just a little valve where you turn off the gas hose and then you let the engine run everything out, so it just basically shuts off from running out of fuel. But that cleans out the carburetor, because I've had to replace the carburetor once when I just put it in storage over the winter and didn't do it. It's just like some of the lawnmowers. The best fuel might be the non-oxygenated fuel that you got. It's a little more expensive, but it doesn't have a lot of the things that, first of all, it'll store longer. And that the issue with gasoline, though, is that, fire codes typically, 5 gallons is about as much as they want you to store, in a home area. Propane, on the other hand, you can store, bigger. I'd go with, you can get the 30, 40-pound tanks, which are, larger, about double this. And then you've got a fuel source that will last, days and usually get you through the, and a typical emergency. So now let's go from the idea of combining a gas generator with a solar generator. Solar is great in that the sun's out, it's wonderful, right? And this solar panel here is a 200-watt solar panel. It's big, right? Unfortunately, it's still only providing 200 watts at its maximum point, which is usually at noonday. In the mornings and in the afternoons, and when a cloud goes over, that panel may only produce maybe 10, 15, 20 watts of electricity. So I often recommend people, if they're going to get a solar generator, they overcompensate and get double the solar panels, because our worst case scenario is that our power outage comes in the middle of the winter. How many hours of sun do we usually have in January and February? And how many days do we go without sun? So consider that in one of your scenarios. Emergency power in the middle of winter. Yeah, I've got my nice solar generator, and I've got that sun source that's just not cooperating, and I might go a week without being able to produce much of any. It might, 3 big solar panels like this might produce enough power to run a light, for, another few days. So a gas generator at that point, I've stored my propane. I can turn that on. I can charge up my generator in, maybe 3, 4, or 5 hours, and then I can turn off my generator, just let it go, and then I can use that to run another 2 days without fuel, without using my gas generator to recharge it again. So great work as a tag team, right? The battery's quiet. Generators are noisy. Generators attract people. Solar generators, the only thing that you would attract people would be at nighttime if you had lights and the rest of the neighborhood didn't. So that's one of those things too that you need to consider too.
Well, if you bought 10 of those solar panels, would you have 2,000 watts of electricity?
So,
But only at certain times of day or something?
right. So the question was, if I bought 10 200-watt solar panels, I might have 2,000 watts of electricity. Yes, and a solar panel, let me go back and redefine solar generator. A solar generator is kind of a marketing term. This battery doesn't generate electricity. Only a solar panel does, and I think you understand that. So the solar panels are what generate electricity. The battery stores it. It's kind of like the dinosaurs generated oil, and gasoline stores it, right?
So you could store that 3,000 watt battery, you could do it with the 10 panels?
So the panels, when they're in the sun, will generate, if you had 10 panels, 2,000 watts of electricity. And if you had a battery, a 3,000, 4,000 watt battery, say I had 10 panels generating 2,000 at noon, I could charge up that battery, say, in two hours. A 3,000 watt battery would hold 3,000 watts of panels or power generated by the solar panels. But once it's full, I can't put anything more into it. So the solar panels, if there's still sun, that power could be used for other things.
And how long does your battery last?
So there's two types. We talk about how long does a battery last. Well, when we talk about it can hold 3,000 watt hours of electricity, and if I had a refrigerator that uses 1,200 watt hours in a 24-hour period, well, it would last running a fridge for about just over 2 days, because if you do the math, 1,200 watts of refrigerator for 24 hours, another 24 hours would be another 2,400 watts. So I would have used all but 600 watt hours of that battery.
Well, so then you could use a lot of solar panels and 3 batteries together, and that would be silent.
It would. So if you've got the resources, you can put thousands of watts of solar on your house, and you can get batteries that are big, 30, 40 kilowatt hours of batteries, put them in your house, then you could have power quietly and probably very, you wouldn't miss much. There's still problems in the wintertime, though. When the sun isn't shining, those panels still won't produce much power.
What do the batteries cost?
Well,
And the panels?
it all depends. There's a lot of different questions. I'm not selling anything here, but typically they're from $1,500 for systems that are, smaller to, $4,000 or $5,000 for portable ones. Sorry.
So my question is, you see people with solar panels on their house.
Mm-hmm.
Is there a way to get that solar panel connected to this battery pack?
So the question is, a lot of people have put solar panels on their home, and some people learn the hard way. So during a power outage, well, I've got these panels on my home, and all of a sudden, where did my power go? I put solar panels on my home and I don't have power. Well, the panels that most people get on their homes are what they call grid tie. And if the grid goes down, the panels stop producing. It's a law, it's a regulation that it won't let those panels produce any electricity, that even if you wanted to use it into your house. And a lot of the issue is that, there's a lot of technology that goes into, we talked about surges and things, and what a solar panel produces is just, it might produce 1,000 watts of electricity, but if your refrigerator needs 1,200 watts, it's not going to rise up and give you any more unless it has a battery. A battery usually tied to an inverter, tied to the solar panel, usually accounts for those type of things. But you could, if you had a battery systems like, these portable ones, you can take the panels off your house if you have the right wire and connector and hook them into that, and they would charge those portable battery systems.
They have an option when you're having those panels installed to have a battery bank inside your house.
Yeah, there's
It's usually about $3,000
or
to do that.
10,000.
Where if you were to buy it yourself and do it, it's about $1,200.
Right.
The markup on that is astronomical.
Yeah.
And when they say a battery bank, it's not a 3,000 watt battery bank. It's usually well under 1,000.
Yeah.
Somewhere between 750 and 800 watts.
So the comment was made that, you know, you can take back inside your house. There's lots of different options, and some go from, you know, 1,000 watts of power, just basic essential type stuff, to bigger ones. And there's some solar systems. I think there's a company called SMA that provides, as long as there's sun shining on the solar panels outside, they give you an outlet that will give you about 2,000 watts of electricity, as long as there's sun on the panels. But it's not for your whole home. It's just basically just like a generator. It's something you could plug into an extension cord to. And if the sun's shining and you've got 4,000 watts of panel, it's going to give you 2,000 watts. I think it might have gone up, you know, in the last few years, but that is an option. Otherwise, you would have to have battery. There's another company called Enphase that their next iteration of their IQ8 inverters will do much the same. It's called a microgrid. They'll create a microgrid internally, and even without batteries, as long as the sun's shining, they'll give you some power that you can use during the day. But at night, which is nice, you could take a battery like this and then just use the AC charger and charge this up during the day when the power is going, and then at night, you know, use it for your power needs. Right, so some good questions.
First of all, you're absolutely correct about the astronomical markup on everything these companies put on your house. Secondly, the reason your power is shut off when the grid goes down is because they can't have you pumping electricity into the lines when the grid's down, when the lineman is working on those lines. That's why they shut you down.
Had a question over here? Yes.
Yeah, so for the solar panels to be charging that generator, do they have to be plugged into it?
Correct. The question was, so how does the solar panels work? So again, back to we talked about generator. The solar panels create or do the actual generation of electricity. And there's a wire that's on the back of every panel, and you would typically, you want those out in the sun, and you might need 50 feet of wire to get it out to where there's no shade or shadow. And you want to keep your battery in the shade because batteries hate heat. So keep them in the shade, keep your solar panels, they're made for the sun, keep everything else in the shade. The sun also deteriorates the plastic in that too, but yeah.
So the generator needs to be outside, and then to connect like any of like the source to your fridge, it has to be plugged into your fridge. So you've got the panel,
right,
and the generator outside, and all these ports that you go through your door.
There's
your furnace and your fridge.
You may want to talk about having the unit that sits by your panel that you can tie your circuits into this, so you don't have to have extension cords going on.
Right. So there's lots of questions about, okay, if I get these things, how do I actually use them? You know, this is a battery. There's like a 700 watt hour battery and something like this. There's, you know, this one has a little bigger battery. This unit has the biggest battery. This unit was one of the first ones I got. It had a lead acid battery. This unit provides more power. I took the battery out of this. That's why I can pick it up. But these lithium battery, you know, here's where, let's see. There's plugs here that the solar panel plugs into. It charges the battery in here. Then you turn on the power, and then you've got your AC power plugs, just like the wall outlet. And you can use this for as long as the battery has power in it. It will provide roughly, 1,500 to 2,000 watts of electricity peak. You know, most things wouldn't do that. But once that battery depletes, then you've got to recharge the battery. Yeah. Yes. The lithium question was, lithium batteries can be inside and not a problem, but you still have to, You would have to move that whole unit out closer to the solar panels to charge it, or have a long extension cord from where this plug is to the device or refrigerator that you're trying to keep going.
Maybe have two generators.
Yeah,
One that's
alternate.
charging and then one that's plugged into the fridge and furnace.
Yep.
And then switch them out.
That's certainly, the comment was made, it might be helpful to have buy two, because while one's charging, you're using the other. And that's certainly a good idea. Right here.
I was just wondering on extension cords, aren't there different grades?
Extension cords is the question. Are there different grades? And yes, basically with wire, the longer the extension cord, the thicker the wire you want. So if you've got a 100-foot extension cord, you want something that's like a 10 gauge wire. And AC power, you can run AC power a lot further than DC power, get back into those type of things. But since we'll stick with AC, even though the solar panels and that, well, that's a whole other concept when you start dealing with wiring for solar panels versus wiring for the actual use of the power. But thicker the better is the thing. And yes, you don't want to be using those little, lamp cord type extension. You want the big garden, yellow, red, the big industrial type. That's what you'd.
Is that a 16 gauge or is that a
10 gauge? So the lower the number, the thicker the wire. When you talk about gauge, so 10 gauge, 12 gauge would probably be the ones you want to stick with. 16, if it's like a 15 to 20 foot, it's too small. And I agree.
Okay,
so
you want the 10 to 12 gauge.
10 to 12 gauge would be, that's going to let you go longer. It's going to, your device may not need it, but it's good to have it, especially if you're running a refrigerator or a washing machine. I've run a washing machine, my front loader washing. I can do about 3 loads of laundry off a unit like this, which in an emergency or a power outage, as long as you have water, you could use these to run your front loader washing machine. A question?
Do you have a business doing this? Can we contact you somewhere?
I'm happy to take emails. I don't have a business anymore, but I can certainly point you to things that I like. And yes, my email is, which one should I give?
Can you write it on the board?
Sure.
And what is your name?
My name's.
On YouTube, so maybe just tell us.
That's.
Maybe you should be a new.
I guess I'll use my old business one. It's grant@getpreparedstuff.com. And so a question.
Oh, sorry. So this is totally a completely different question. So the generator and the ham radios, would an EMP knock those out?
Potentially, yes.
Even the solar?
So there's lots of things with, these solar things are made with different components. Solar panel is a device. There's diodes on it, but the wires on it are thicker. I've accidentally shorted a solar panel with a capacitor, and the damage that it did was it burned out. On the back of these, there's a diode that if you're to hook solar panels in series, that diode helps. If one of the panels is shaded, it helps the power to continue the flow and complete a DC circuit. But those diodes are replaceable, and those diodes may, in an EMP, get fried. The thing is, the solar panel will still work without those diodes. But if you have shading, though, and you've hooked them up in series, then the solar panel is going to basically stop producing power until the sun comes back on all of them.
Yeah.
And at nighttime, well, most of these solar generators, they have a blocking diode that will prevent it from draining. If you had, a truly do-it-yourself system where you're running the solar panel directly to a battery, then yeah, you'd want to compensate. But a typical cheap charge controller will prevent the battery from draining in those type of scenarios.
Is that solar?
So this is a solar charge controller. So, there's technical details. Everything in this box, there's a charge controller, there's an inverter, there's, battery, there's a USB, there's lots of converters, there's lots of things that go into these, which makes why it's so simple now just to go and buy this whole unit. If you wanted to build it, then you would need a solar panel, you need the wires to go to the charge controller, then the wire to go to the battery, then from the battery to the inverter, and so on and so forth. So it's all do-it-yourselfable, but there's different types of batteries too. An EMP, the typical lead acid battery that you have in your car, and the old type of batteries, they'll be just fine after an EMP. The new type of batteries, the lithium, they have what they call a BMS, a battery management system, and that BMS is what will be likely fried during an EMP. The battery itself will likely be just fine. So in some cases, you like to learn a little more about how that works, and you could open this up, swap out a BMS that you've put, in a Faraday cage or something and preserved, and get your battery working again. A 12-volt lithium battery, even without a BMS, you could probably limp along if you're careful, and it would still work just fine. When you get into, these higher end, larger battery arrays, yeah, you're going to just struggle. So there's lots of options out there, and you can do the homework and learn which one is, most easily or most robust type of thing, and which would, some of the easiest ones are the least, fixable. It's kind of like cell phones.
That's a Faraday cage.
Okay.
Also, while you're on this subject, somebody asked me the question, maybe you can take it right now.
Okay.
About how these can be affected, and would you want to protect them with Faraday?
Okay.
And I show this.
Oh, good deal. So we talk in the scenario of an EMP. Is there anyone who isn't familiar with what an EMP stands for? Okay. So this is a scenario that's good to consider. An EMP is an electromagnetic pulse, and it usually comes at the beginning of World War, right? Basically, an EMP happens anytime a nuclear, did I say that right? Device goes off. It's just a surge of power that just fills the atmosphere, and that power goes someplace, and usually it latches onto the wires of the power grid, and there's just a spike of electricity that goes through and fries the electronics and so on. Back when they were doing the nuclear or hydrogen bomb testing in the South Pacific, even Hawaii, there was a point where they lit off a hydrogen bomb, and the power grid in Hawaii was fried and took it out. It blew all the transformers out because of that. The wire is a big antenna, and it collected all that power, and the power wants to go somewhere, and it went right through the transformers, and the transformers couldn't handle it, and it blew those apart. Same thing would happen with a lot of these devices. If, Kenneth here is one of our experts on EMPs and such, but everything, is an antenna, and if it's small enough, it may not be affected. But if there's a lot of metal loves to attract power, and so this would be an antenna point, and the power would go in. It could overwhelm the devices, the electronics inside, and at that point, everything's fried.
Anything larger than 12 by 12, 12 inches by 12 inches of metal can act as a receiver or an antenna.
Yeah.
Even if it's not plugged in?
Even if it's not plugged in.
So
Well, that's your car battery.
What that does is it'll channel all that electricity into wherever it wants to go. And so it'll fry a lot of things, like on your cars, your starter, your alternator, your electronic ignition, radio.
It's getting worse too as the cars get more advanced.
Basically, you've got a 2.5 big so, yeah, but the thing is for smaller things like what what Scott was showing with the radio. Yes, that has an antenna on it, but take a look at the length of that, okay? Now.
Advantage
right
too
there
is
is not, there's not enough metal to act as a receiver, but because I'm really OCD, I take my antenna off.
Yeah, I would always,
So it's in two parts.
I would store it
If you
separately.
put rubber over that one, would it work? Would it keep it safe?
over the, so.
Rubber has nothing to do with it.
So let's talk about EMP mitigation. So a Faraday cage, as we talked about, is something that creates a bubble for anything that's inside it. So this is a Faraday cage. It's just copper window screening, but because it's conductive, all the power that would go would create a bubble for anything inside it. So anything you put inside this, like
This could be just solid metal. If you had a solid metal cage, solid metal box, where you closed up all the gaps, that would work also. But because the EMP, because the wavelength is a certain size, it can't get through certain sizes of holes. So this has a small enough holes that it won't go through. And what we're trying to do is trying to seal it so that there is not a large hole anywhere around this to get into the electronics inside. So this is a Faraday cage, because any electromagnetic wave is just going to, like you said, go around the outside, but it won't penetrate the interior.
So there's lots of ways, lots of ways to mitigate or create. Even a metal garbage can, if you're really careful, you can put stuff in a metal garbage can, make sure the lid's sealed with something metallic tape or something that you basically want to create a bubble, isolate anything electronic inside that cage.
You all have a Faraday cage in your kitchen.
Your microwave.
Before as you're using that as a Faraday cage, remember that there's something in there before you try to make pop.
So there's lots of ways. That's a whole nother talk, I guess, or things. But we're basically out of time at this point in regards to emergency power. But first of all, consider your scenario. Understand what we did. Most of what we talked about was home. You also need to consider what, if you're in your car or an RV outside of those things, your things change in what is essential. But there are solutions, from generators, solar, other type of things, to provide backup power sources in emergency, and we're glad to answer any questions hereafter, or send me an email.